In Boston, Massachusetts, in 1821, Dr. Samuel Thompson filed suit against the Reverend Elias Smith for patent infringement. The self-educated Thompson was the founder of America's botanical medical movement. Smith was the leading preacher of the Second Great Awakening and had been Thompson's general agent since 1817. The patent in question had been obtained by Thompson in 1813, covering a specification for preparing and using certain medicines in fevers, colics, dysenteries, and rheumatism. In this paper, I will use Samuel Thompson's career and his 1821 suit in particular to explore the relationship between intellectual property and the marketplace in the early American Republic. Federal IP protection is a method of incentivizing innovation that depends on the marketplace. A patent simply provides a competitive edge by creating a temporary monopoly. Moreover, the advantage conferred is influenced by the prevailing legal culture, since it depends upon the patent holder's ability to defend his property in the courts. While the constitutional underpinning of US patent law has remained relatively static since the nation's founding, cultural attitudes about monopoly and fair competition have changed over time. These attitudes are reflected in legal decisions and government policies, as well as in the marketplace itself. Today, I will argue that Samuel Thompson viewed his medical discoveries as intellectual property, which he defended in creative ways. He was an innovator in the context of a competitive medical marketplace. He sold his intellectual property in contracts that required secrecy in exchange for therapeutic knowledge. When the contracts proved permeable, Thompson applied for patents and copyrights. He published an autobiography to bolster his claims to originality, and he used the courts primarily to defend his professional reputation. Despite his ingenuity, it seemed that Thompson's competitors were always one step ahead. Thompson put great faith in the power of the US IP laws, but he was frequently disappointed by the outcomes of his legal battles. Thompson's experience thus serves as a case study of the relationship between legal IP protection and entrepreneurial marketing strategies in the early American Republic. Our knowledge of Samuel Thompson's life comes principally from the polemical autobiography he published in 1822 at the age of 53, 1 year after his suit with Smith. Thompson described himself as a preternaturally gifted healer. He claimed to have discovered the emetic properties of the lobelia plant when he chewed some of its leaves at the age of 4. Sometime around the turn of the 19th century, Thompson left his New Hampshire farm to become a professional healer. His first step was to better formulate a theory of these healing practices, to give it a sense of coherence and to allow him to teach it to others. His usual regimen of steam baths and repeated puking and purging was very time-consuming, so in order for it to be economically viable, Thompson needed to generate many followers. Since heat was the source of life, Thompson theorized that medicine should be used to increase bodily heat. He likened the stomach to the furnace of a steam engine. Vomiting and purging were therapeutic because they removed the cold canker that smothered the furnace. Thompson settled upon 6 herbal compounds, in addition to steaming, which seemed effective in increasing bodily heat and removing obstructions. Their key ingredients included lobelia, cayenne pepper, bayberry, balmony, peach, and myrrh. Thompson's medicines could be drunk as a tea, rolled into pills, administered in enema, or sometimes applied directly to the skin. In his autobiography, there is a striking emphasis on the innovation of this system. He denied any derivative knowledge and insisted on his practical and intellectual expenditure. These features helped to establish his claims to intellectual property. Thompson's key innovation around this time was the idea of selling rights to his system of healing, which functioned like legal contracts. For $20 and a vow of secrecy, ordinary citizens could purchase the knowledge and medicines to treat themselves and their families. Thompson provided written and oral information about his system, for example, in the form of a poem to aid memory. and labelled his medicines from 1 to 6. This was deliberately simpler than the Latin prescriptions of orthodox physicians, but also allowed Thomson to maintain trade secrets about the contents of his medicines. Thomson also appointed a number of agents to sell rights and medicines, which Thomson still manufactured exclusively and identified only by the numbers 1 to 6. The agents were provided with a certificate which functioned as a contract. This example from the 1830s, I'm not sure if you can see it all that well, entitled the agent to sell family rights, including the autobiography, for $20. The certificate also specified prices for Thomsonian medicines to prevent underselling by his agents. Agents were entitled to offer a 1/3 discount for medicine purchases over $10. The certificate also included confidential instructions for preparing certain medicines, and it reminded agents to do justice to Thomson, not to sell to regular physicians, not to sell poisons or shed blood. The certificate featured the US seal, presumably to remind agents and rights holders alike that Thomson would defend his intellectual property with the full force of federal law. As a further deterrent, Thomson apparently charged his agents a $2,000 bond, although there's no evidence of his ever trying to claim this. This rights system had at least 3 advantages. It allowed Thomson to make money up front. It allowed many more converts than Thomson could possibly have treated alone. And it embodied Thomson's Republican, anti-elitist approach, which led to the slogan, "Every man his own physician." In 1813, Thomson secured a patent on his system of healing from the Federal Patent Examiner in Washington, D.C. In his patent, Thomson claimed a specification for preparing and using certain medicines in fevers, colics, dysenteries, and rheumatism. He listed the contents of his 6 numbered medicines and included a description of how to use them in case of illness. So why did Thomson want a patent? Patents were expensive. Thomson paid $30. They required the applicant to reveal the contents of his invention, and there was little certainty, given the legal culture and the underdeveloped court system, that a patent holder could protect against trespass if he sued in the courts. I speculate that Thomson's desire for a patent developed as a result of his experiences in the competitive medical marketplace. He likely sought the prestige of a federal utility patent to counter the charges of skeptical physicians and to lend legitimacy to his method. He wanted the patent as a legal tool to discourage and prosecute imitators. He used it as a general deterrent, taken alongside his other IP protections, contracts with his appointed agents, secrecy, and copyright. It bolstered the image of Thomson as someone who would actively defend his IP. What was Thomson's understanding of intellectual property? I believe that he felt a sense of ownership over the therapeutics that he had developed and refined after many years of practice. His writings indicate that he felt vulnerable and underappreciated as a healer in the marketplace. He resented that physicians could make a living by doing harm, and so he sought to secure financial benefits from his intellectual and practical work. Thomson may also have been enticed by the financial success of the patent medicine entrepreneurs. So who were Samuel Thomson's business competitors? The early American medical marketplace was notable in its diversity. Patients could choose from herbalists, midwives, bone setters, ministers, wise women, Negro doctors, and Indian doctors. Regular physicians, also known as orthodox practitioners, represented a minority of healers. There was also a vast array of proprietary concoctions, so-called patent medicines, imported from England and increasingly pirated and developed in the US. We need to distinguish between patent medicines, nostrums or mixtures with secret ingredients and usually fabulous properties, and patented medicines, those having received a US utility patent. The important difference was that the ingredients of patented medicines had to be revealed to the patent office. The practice of medicine in the US was essentially unregulated in Thomson's time. In the first decades of the 19th century, almost all states passed medical licensing acts that favoured the members of regular medical societies. However, licensing served principally to distinguish the orthodox from the non-orthodox. the only legal advantage given to regular physicians was the ability to recover debts with the courts. As the phenomenal growth of Samuel Thompson's movement suggests, this was little barrier to doctors who simply requested payment in advance. Almost all 19th century healers agreed that the aim of medicine was to restore the body to balance, which could be achieved by manipulating the body's emissions. Vomiting and purging were key aspects of regular medicine, as well as in Thompson's approach. However, Thompson used exclusively plant-based concoctions and was opposed to bloodletting. By 1816, Thompson complained that he was worn out from constantly attending upon those labouring under disease. He therefore determined to appoint a general agent who, as he wrote, would do justice to me and the cause, which would enable me to retire from practice and receive a share of the profits as a reward for my long sufferings. In Boston, Thompson met Elias Smith. Smith was a charismatic and highly successful preacher from the Second Great Awakening. He was also an effective employer of the new print media. His Herald of Gospel Liberty, first published in 1808, was one of the most influential newspapers of the Second Great Awakening and reflected the growing use of print in a variety of reform movements. In Smith, Thompson found a like-minded man of his own age, similarly dedicated to eradicating elitist influences in government, religion, and medicine. Thompson appointed Smith as his general agent in 1817. Unfortunately, Smith's relationship with Thompson soured in 1819, going the way of so many of Thompson's business partnerships. Thompson had engaged Smith with the hope of preparing an autobiography that would explain Thompson's system of healing and his lifelong commitment to it. Thompson relied upon Smith's experience in publishing and his greater literacy. Smith arranged to print a narrative of Thompson's life in 1819, but he published it badly, leaving out 12 pages of instructions and secured the copyright in his own name. Smith claimed this was simple oversight, but Thompson feared sabotage. Smith then began making his own medicines, apparently because he could no longer afford Thompson's. In 1820, he advertised in the Boston Herald to publish details of the Thompsonian system by subscription for $5, which, to Thompson's distress, mostly stopped the sale of rights. After a number of failed negotiations, Thompson resorted to the courts. In 1821, Thompson sued Smith for patent infringement. Perhaps surprisingly, given Smith's open appropriation of Thompson's IP, the suit was unsuccessful. The judge, who was in fact Joseph Story, the decision handed down in 1822 prompted Thompson to take his cause to the public. As his supporters explained, the judge's ruling that the specification in his patent was not correctly made out was no evidence against the justice of his cause. In response to his grievances, Thompson published a potentially libelous pamphlet that detailed Smith's treachery. Smith, incensed, convened a council of clerics to assess Thompson's claims. Consequently, Thompson assembled his own committee to plead his case. Thompson and Smith's recourse to the press indicates the extent to which both healers relied upon their public image and brand. In his defense, Smith argued that Thompson had compelled him to act. He claimed that Thompson had never supplied him with enough medicines or copies of the rights booklets, and was generally difficult to work with. Smith protested his dismissal as Thompson's agent, and felt vindicated by Thompson's failed suit against him. As his counsel explained, as Mr. Smith now found himself released from all legal demands, and having been put to much trouble and expense by Dr. Thompson, thought it perfectly right for him to avail himself of any lawful means to recompense himself in some degree for what he had suffered, and therefore published a book containing his own mode of practice, which he called an improvement on Dr. Thompson's. In other words, Smith interpreted this conflict as one in which both parties were guilty. If he had let down his side of the bargain, it was only because Thompson had forced his hand. He did not recognise Thompson's intellectual property as an issue separate from the general one of breached contract. With the court on his side and Thompson's patent invalidated, Smith felt free to exploit what he had learned from Thompson in his own medical practice. Thompson seems to have realised that Smith did not understand his definition of intellectual property. In his reply, he included a long justification for his business practices, which Smith had interpreted as greed. Dr. Thompson, having discovered a new and useful system of medical practice, and by much labour and suffering brought the same into public use so as to be profitable, it is just as much his property as any man's house or farm can possibly be, and to take it from him without his consent is as much a crime in point of honesty and fair dealings as it would be to rob him of his purse or anything else that belongs to him. This remarkable statement emphasises the non-obviousness of intellectual property when compared with physical property. Thompson felt the need to explain to Smith and his public that the issue at stake was knowledge. Knowledge that Thompson had invested time in accruing, knowledge with financial value. Accordingly, Smith's actions, far from being an acceptable application of his apprenticeship under Thompson, in fact amounted to theft. Thompson's statement also suggests that the concept of intellectual property still required defence in this early national period. The poor enforcement of IP law was partly attributable to the small size of the courts and legal apparatus, but may also have reflected a cultural tension between the desire to reward innovation and the great fear of monopolies. From the early days of his medical practice, Samuel Thompson had attempted to retain control of his IP by using what amounted to trade secrets and contracts. Although he never legally prosecuted anyone for breach of contract, he used the negative publicity to harm trespassers' business prospects and to encourage others to maintain secrecy. While Thompson was able to earn money from this project, he was unable to prevent so-called improvements, and he resented the lack of respect he received from orthodox physicians as well as some of his patients. Thompson applied for a utility patent in 1813 so that he could have the clout of the federal government behind him. He rarely won his patent infringement suits, but he valued his court appearances as a form of advertising. In many instances, he avoided the courts altogether and preferred to denounce the patent infringers publicly. Regardless, Thompson applied for and was granted 2 subsequent patents, one in 1823 and another upon its expiry in 1837. Thompson was extremely proud of his patent and felt it warranted the time and expense of the application process. He made frequent allusions to it in all of his publications, and he affixed a copy of the US Great Seal to his agent's certificates. Thompson felt he deserved a patent and the protection it held out because he felt he deserved rewards from his intellectual labour. At first, Thompson had a receptive audience in his fellow Americans. As the Jeffersonian Republic embraced Jeffersonian democracy, many agreed that elite authority in politics, medicine, and religion was unseemly in a Republican nation. His supporters were not concerned by his lack of formal education. In any case, the therapies seemed to work. But it seems that very few Americans agreed with Thompson's definition of intellectual property rights. Although we do not have the figures for rank-and-file Thompsonians, none of Thompson's agents stayed loyal to his monopoly for more than a few years, although almost all continued to practice a form of botanical healing inspired by him. By the 1830s, Samuel Thompson might have claimed victory. His system of practice was increasingly popular and respectable. Across the nation, Thompsonian supporters successfully petitioned their legislatures to repeal the Medical Licensing Act that discriminated against regular practitioners. In some states, up to half the population used Thompsonian healing, and as many as 1 million Americans probably followed him nationwide. But Thompson had lost control of his IP and was increasingly irrelevant to the movement that bore his name. One of Thompson's former agents wrote in the inaugural edition of his Botanic journal in 1836 that Thompsonians should endeavour to award Thompson all the credit and honour that is justly his due, but we shall go for the cause and nothing but the cause. At issue was Thompson's difficult personality, but also his refusal to countenance any improvements on his system and his opposition to formal education for healers. Thomson was caught between the desire to maintain control of his IP and the desire to reap financial rewards from it. After all, his patent was only useful in the marketplace. But Thomson was unable to protect his monopoly against trespassing in different courts, and he had only a weak advantage in the marketplace. Accordingly, Thomson tried to use the IP laws as a form of advertising to maximize his marketplace advantage. As we have seen, however, it was no simple matter for Samuel Thomson to convince his fellow citizens that a man's ideas were as much his property as any man's house.